he did have a lot of missing time. So it makes you wonder, did something else happen in that time? Was he even underground? Uh, when the cave-in happened, was he even underground? Was he walking around this a cave in the Zhiguli mountain, or in the mountain, or was he somewhere else? It with that much missing time, who knows?
In 1932, Viktor Agiev was employed as a member of a special prospecting party from the Vogelstroi. He and some other geologists had camped outside the village of Sheryevo and were studying the so-called Shereyevsky natural tunnels or caves in the Zhiguli Mountains on the Samurskaya Luka Peninsula, which was encircled by the river Volga opposite to the city of Samara. He and the others had ventured into the cave and were carrying out their examination when a collapse occurred. All of the geologists succeeded in crawling out of the cave except Agiev. A search for their missing comrade ensued. It lasted 2 days with no trace of Agiev being found. They assumed that he must have perished under the falling rock and presumed him dead. Curiously, several days later, Agiev appeared safe and alive. He made his way into the village after descending from the opposite slope of Zhiguli Mountain, made contact with the geologists who were rightly shocked to see him alive. A man named Barkov, who headed up the special party, asked Agiev what had happened to him, how he was able to find his way out. Agiev proceeded to tell him a story so strange that Barkov advised him never to speak of it to anyone. With Stalin in power at the time, Agiev understood the gravity of the situation, that such things were better not discussed, and agreed to heed Barkov's advice. And he did that for the remainder of his life. Just prior to passing away, Agiev, still of sound mind, decided to take the opportunity to write down his recollections of the event in the Zhiguli Mountains back in 1932. His report was eventually submitted via family members to a St. Petersburg newspaper. It was printed in full in an article the paper ran about strange anomalies in the Zhiguli Mountain. According to Agiev, when the collapse happened, he found his path out of the cave blocked by several large stones. They were far too large for him to move by hand, and he was completely cut off from the rest of the team. Uncertain of what to do, he began to crawl ahead along a narrow space where neither he nor any of the other prospectors had ever been before. He was hoping that it might lead him out of the underground into the surface. Agiev understood that he would be fine for a few days, as he was carrying several cans of food, some dry crusts of bread, some matches, an electric lantern, as well as some reserve batteries. Though he knew that the supplies were a small comfort, any chance of survival hinged on him finding his way out, and he was resolved to doing just that, regardless of how many spider and rat-infested holes he had to crawl through. After wandering endlessly through the narrow crevices, he found himself stepping into what he could only describe as a, quote, spacious hall, with some corners filled with ice. As he looked around, Agiev began to notice that something was odd. Despite it being dark with no visible light source, the entire hall was lit up a faint blue color. Then something truly strange happened. Agiev claims that upon taking notice of the blue light, his mind was suddenly and inexplicably, quote, switched off. Up to that point, he had felt an incredible sense of worry, fear, anxiety, and this was mixed with the fact that he was quite hungry, but understood that he could not eat as he needed to ration his food. After he was switched off, all these feelings vanished. He no longer felt any worry. He no longer feared the darkness around him. He no longer felt a desire to eat. He was just there in the cavern, and he felt calm. Under any normal circumstance, he would not feel this way. And yet, that is how he felt after being switched off.
This thing about being switched off, I've talked about it in a lot of videos over the years where people will describe, observing a UFO or encountering some being, and suddenly it's like they are switched off. Like they're a robot, or like C-3PO. And it's kind of frightening to think that these beings have this ability to just turn us off.
He next entered a narrow corridor with huge icy masses or blocks of ice which stood near the walls. These were single blocks of ice, not a large mass. The most amazing thing was that in the center of each block of ice was something he couldn't quite believe. Encased inside was a strange creature, apparently frozen within the ice. While they looked humanoid, these things were not human. Agiev admitted that he didn't know what they were. As he moved along the corridor, Agiev came to realize that there were thousands of these things, all encased in their own block of ice. Agiev found it extremely difficult to describe the creatures he saw. They had large hairless heads, huge bulging eyes, massive, quote, bulbs on their forehead, small hands with 3 clawed fingers. One finger was opposite to the other two, which were pressed to their bellies in a sort of pose. Their bodies were massive, bluish-green, and scaly. The best way he could sum it up was that they appeared to be basically bipedal dinosaurs with huge developed brains. The icy blocks continued to increase in size the further into the cavernous corridor he walked. Curiously, the larger the blocks got, the larger the, quote, monsters contained inside of them got. He next encountered several blocks or ice crystals, the inner side of which was covered by a net of thin cracklings. While standing near these crystals, Agiev claims that he felt an unexplained sadness. He did not know why. Agiev continued to advance through the dark, seemingly endless corridor for what he guessed was about 3 hours. He eventually arrived at a fork in the corridor, which split into two. The left corridor, as far as he could see, had the same cubes of ice stretched all along the walls, with their frozen creatures inside. The right corridor offered the same, more cubes of ice, only the creatures inside these ones were slightly different. These ones lacked the bulbous protrusions on their forehead. He decided that he wanted to get a better look at these ones, and so he chose to carry on down the right corridor, unsure of where it would lead him, though he hoped that it would eventually take him out of this strange place. Before he could step into the corridor, something happened to Agiev that he could not explain. He didn't want to call it a blackout, as he did not feel the sensation of passing out, only that time seemed to jump forward. Agiev came to believe that he indeed did not black out, only that whatever he saw during this walk along the right corridor was somehow erased from his mind. A large piece of his memory was simply gone, and he could not, for the life of him, recall it. His memory picked up again as he approached a broadening section of the corridor. In the center of the cavernous chamber, Agiev saw 2 solar reflections or sun rays, one atop the other. They completely blocked his way, and he had no choice but to walk through the center of the sun ray. At that very same moment, something struck Agiev on his forehead. It was such a powerful blow that it caused Agiev to lose consciousness. When Agiev came back to his senses, he was no longer inside the cave. Someone or something had moved him back to the surface. As he breathed in the fresh air and basked in the blinding sunlight on his face, he came to realize that he wasn't alone. Sitting near him was a strange creature, similar to a very large dog, only it was not like any dog he'd ever seen before. Its body was covered with hair. It had pointed dog-like ears and a dog-like face. Agiev felt weak and rose to his feet. He was so confused and exhausted that he opted not to pay attention to the strange dog creature, as it did not seem to be aggressive. It was merely watching him. Agiev recognized that he was on top of Mount Popova, approximately 10 kilometers from Sarajevo. He began to make his way down the mountain, away from the dog creature. Agiev assumed that he had only been gone for a few hours. It was only when he returned to the geologist's camp in the village that he realized that he'd been missing for 5 days. Agiev was surprised by this, as he could only recall the few hours he had spent wandering inside the cave. The rest of that time he could not remember. Looking back, Agiev came to believe that when he was inside the underground cavern, he had accidentally stumbled upon some type of graveyard. He found it odd his memory of the walk along the right corridor was wiped, while the other stuff he observed leading up to it remained intact. Did he see something in the right corridor that he wasn't supposed to?
He said that he thought maybe that this was a type of graveyard. That, instead of caskets, there were these blocks of ice with these creatures inside of it. So they didn't decay. And he did say that he felt this sense of sadness. And a lot of people who walk through graveyards will describe this feeling of sadness that comes over them. But in 1932, nobody had ever heard of such a thing. So, but he said it, had the features of a dog, but it wasn't a dog. So, what else could it have been? It sure sounds like a dog man. Or what we would know nowadays as a dog man. Was the dog-like creature working with the beings underground? Was it? Is that the thing that brought him to the surface? Was it like a helper or kind of like a guardian